Right now, on March 3rd, 2026, the Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed. 20 million barrels of oil per day have stopped moving through the world's most critical waterway. Not disrupted, not delayed. The insurance market pulled coverage on March the 2nd, and without coverage, no captain sales. The strait closed without a single military order. Here's the number that explains everything you need to understand. 20% of the world's entire daily oil supply flows through just 21 miles of open water. One corridor, no bypass. Iran didn't need to fire a weapon to make this happen. What it did instead is something far more calculated and far harder for Washington to respond to with any clean political justification. IRGC fast attack craft began conducting close proximity maneuvers near commercial tankers in the northern approaches. Lloyd's of London pulled war risk coverage within hours of those reports. No insurance means no captain sales regardless of what naval escorts are available. No sailing means no oil moves. The strait closed through a private financial mechanism, not a military blockade. This is not a new playbook. It is the exact mechanism from the 1980s tanker war in these same waters. Every underwriting desk in London carries that institutional memory. Iran counted on it precisely. The political liability for the closure is now distributed across dozens of private insurance firms, not concentrated in one government's military command structure that Washington can directly target or respond to. Iran's strategists spent decades studying this mechanism. What you are watching on March 3rd is its deliberate, full-scale activation, executed with precision and almost no political exposure for Tehran. Now let's talk about what 20 million barrels per day disappearing actually does to your life. Because this is where it stops being a geopolitical story and starts being a personal economic event. JP Morgan's official published estimate for a full Hormuz closure scenario puts Brent crude at $120 to $130 per barrel. That is not a fringe forecast. That is the largest bank in the United States. The Dallas Federal Reserve ran scenario modeling specifically on Hormuz disruption. Their finding, WTI crude moves toward $100 per barrel. U.S. headline inflation rises by 1.3 percentage points within 6 months. Oxford Economics modeled the severe scenario. Brent at $130, U.S. inflation reaching 6%. The Federal Reserve facing a choice with no good options available on either side of the rate decision. For the average American driver, Gas Buddy analysts project pump prices moving from roughly $3 per gallon toward $4.50 within weeks of a sustained disruption. And that is the floor, not the ceiling. That is before the cascade reaches trucking costs, food distribution, manufacturing inputs, heating bills, and airline tickets. Energy is embedded in the price of everything, every single thing you buy. Here is the alternative route math that every news anchor is getting wrong this week. Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline and the UAE's Habshan-Fujairah line together move about 2.6 million barrels per day. The strait moves 20 million. The gap between 2.6 and 20 is not something you close with emergency SPR releases or weekend diplomatic calls. That gap is structural and has been for 50 years. Every barrel exported by Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, the UAE, Qatar, and Iran itself transits the same 21 miles. There is no version of this geography where you simply reroute the supply chain around it. The U.S. holds roughly 400 million barrels in its strategic petroleum reserve. Europe and Asian nations combined hold over 1 billion. At current global consumption rates, that buys approximately 2 months. 2 months. That is the entire duration of the world's emergency buffer against a full closure. After that, the global economy is running on supply it has no mechanism to replace through any existing infrastructure. Now here is the detail that reshapes the entire strategic picture. The one that almost no mainstream outlet is connecting clearly right now on March 3rd. The country most economically exposed to this closure is not the United States. America now sources only about 7% of its crude imports through Hormuz, thanks to a decade of domestic shale expansion. The most exposed country is China. Approximately 25% of China's total oil supply transits this single corridor every day. India follows closely, with nearly half its crude imports now at direct risk. China has warships physically present in the Gulf right now. They have been positioned there since the Maritime Security Belt 2026 exercise, launched in February alongside Russian and Iranian naval units. China publicly aligned itself with Iran's strategic posture through that exercise, and simultaneously, China is the government that suffers the most severe economic damage if the strait stays closed. That contradiction has no clean resolution. It is one of the most consequential unresolved tensions in this situation, playing out in the same waters where tankers stopped moving. Now let's open up what Iran actually has deployed in that water. Because the fast boat footage that gets all the coverage is only the visible surface of something far more dangerous underneath. According to open-source defense assessments updated through early 2025, Iran's naval mine stockpile sits between 5,000 and 6,000 mines. U.S. military officials publicly confirm figures in that range. These include bottom influence mines that sit on the seafloor, are extremely difficult to detect and clear, and create disproportionate operational disruption, even when they are never actually detonated. The threat of their presence alone is sufficient to halt commercial traffic entirely. You don't need to sink a ship, you need insurers to believe you might. Iran crossed that threshold on March 2nd. Iran also operates more than 20 Ghadir-class mini-submarines built specifically for the shallow, acoustically complex coastal waters of the Strait and the broader Persian Gulf environment. These are not blue water vessels designed for open ocean. They were purpose-built to exploit an environment where advanced U.S. anti-submarine warfare systems genuinely struggle to perform at full capability. In 200 feet of turbulent, thermocline-layered Gulf water, the acoustic signatures that make submarines detectable in deep ocean become far harder to isolate and track with any reliable precision. The Ghadir doesn't need range. It doesn't need speed. It needs to wait. Because in a 2-mile shipping lane with no alternate route, every incoming vessel has exactly nowhere else to go. And from 3 strategic islands sitting directly inside the strait, Abu Musa, Greater Tunb, and Lesser Tunb, Iran has drone systems already positioned inside the engagement zone before any defense cycle begins. Iran has controlled those 3 islands since 1971. From that position, drone swarms don't need to travel to reach their targets. They are already exactly where they need to be when the order is given. Each defensive intercept costs between $400,000 and $2 million, depending on the system used. Each Iranian attack drone costs a fraction of that figure. The cost-exchange ratio runs entirely against the defender. You don't win swarm warfare by shooting down every incoming drone. You win by exhausting your opponent's interceptor inventory, or their political tolerance for the cost. Whichever limit is reached first. What all of this represents together is not a military designed to defeat the United States in open conventional battle. It is a system engineered specifically to make the strait ungovernable at a cost Iran can sustain. The mines, the mini-submarines, the island-based drone capacity, and the insurance mechanism are not 4 separate tools. They are one integrated architecture. Every single component is active as of March 3rd. None of this happened by accident. 7 years of trilateral exercises with Russia and China built the coordination, the protocols, and the tactical familiarity this moment required. 7 years of preparation is not improvisation. It is a design assembled in plain sight, tested in the same geography, and activated at the moment its architects calculated it would matter most. If this changed how you're reading the Gulf headlines today, drop a comment right now. What do you think oil prices hit in the next 30 days? A deal? $100? Or something nobody has modeled yet? Hit the like button now. It helps more people find this analysis when it matters most. And on this story, the next development could come within hours, not days. In the next section, we open the full economic cascade. What $120 oil does to inflation, to the Federal Reserve's options, and to every government in Asia watching its energy supply vanish. The military story and the economic story are not 2 separate things happening in parallel. They are the same story, and the numbers on the economic side are already moving. Stay with me. Here's a number that every analyst on Wall Street is watching right now on March 3rd. Brent crude crossed $83 per barrel this morning. That is up more than 14% in under 72 hours. Bob McNally, a former energy advisor to the White House, said it publicly on Saturday. A prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz is a guaranteed global recession. Not a risk. Guaranteed. That word came from a former presidential advisor, not a fringe commentator. And as of this morning, the conditions that would produce exactly that outcome are still fully in place. Let's talk about what the market is actually pricing right now. Because the gap between where oil is today and where it goes, if this continues for weeks, is the story nobody is finishing. Goldman Sachs estimates $18 of that Brent price is pure war risk premium sitting on top of the underlying price. Citi puts Brent in the $80 to $90 range this week, with room to drop to $70 if things cool fast. The pessimistic scenario, the one that Barclays, UBS, and Oxford Economics all have on their boards right now, puts Brent at $100 or higher within weeks if the strait stays effectively closed. Oxford Economics goes further. In their severe disruption scenario, Brent reaches $130. U.S. inflation hits 6%. The Federal Reserve loses every option it had for rate cuts this year. Here is what makes March 3rd different from every prior oil price spike in recent history. This is not a supply threat. The supply is already not moving. The disruption is happening right now. Claudio Galimberti, chief economist at Rystad Energy, said this week, "We have not seen anything like this in the history of the Strait of Hormuz." He compared it to blocking the aorta of a circulatory system. That comparison is more precise than it sounds. When the aorta is blocked, the body doesn't fail gradually, it fails fast. And the global economy runs on energy the same way the body runs on blood. Let's look at what is actually stranded right now. because the scale of what is sitting in the water waiting to move is one of the most underreported details of this crisis as of March 3rd. According to ship tracking data from marine traffic, at least 150 tankers have dropped anchor in open Gulf waters beyond the strait. Crude tankers, LNG vessels, all sitting, all loaded, all going nowhere. These ships are clustered off the coasts of Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. The oil is produced. It is on board. It has buyers waiting. It simply cannot move through the only exit that exists. Every day those ships sit anchored, the supply gap widens. Onshore storage fills toward capacity. Producers face decisions about slowing output. That cascade is already beginning. Now let's go beyond oil, because the LNG dimension of this crisis is hitting some markets harder than the oil price move itself, and almost no coverage is leading with it. Qatar is the world's largest LNG exporter. A dominant share of European and Asian LNG imports originates there. All of it transits the same 21-mile corridor that is now effectively closed. European natural gas prices surged more than 70% over the past week after Qatar Energy halted LNG production following attacks on its facilities. That is the largest weekly move since the 2022 energy crisis. For European households still recovering from that 2022 shock, this number is not abstract. It is heating bills, electricity costs, and manufacturing input prices all hitting simultaneously in one wave. In Asia, the exposure is more direct. Kepler data shows roughly 83% of all LNG through the strait goes to Asian markets. Japan and South Korea have almost no domestic energy production to fall back on. South Asia faces the sharpest immediate impact. Qatar and the UAE together account for 99% of Pakistan's LNG imports and 72% of Bangladesh's. Those supply chains cannot be diversified quickly. India faces what one analyst called a dual physical and financial shock. More than half of its LNG imports are Gulf-linked, and approximately 60% of its total crude oil imports come from the Middle East. Now, let's bring this back to the United States. Because the assumption that America is insulated from Hormuz disruption due to domestic shale production is real but incomplete in one critical way. The U.S. does not import significant crude through Hormuz, but oil is globally priced. When Brent moves, WTI moves. When WTI moves, the pump price moves. There's no domestic price island in a global shock. Gas Buddy analyst Patrick DeHaan projects U.S. pump prices rising 10 to 30 cents in the near term, with individual stations potentially seeing spikes up to 85 cents. That is before the cascade hits trucking. That is before the rise in diesel costs works through freight rates. Before manufacturing inputs reprice. Before the energy component of every grocery item adjusts. The transmission takes weeks, not months. Here's the political dimension that makes this crisis structurally different for the Trump administration, and it comes down to one number the White House cannot ignore for long. WTI is currently near $76. That is comfortably above the roughly $60 per barrel break even for U.S. shale producers. Domestically, higher prices support production, but they also reignite inflation. Kepler put the administration's pain threshold clearly. Sustained Brent above $90 for 2 weeks. Conflicts directly with the domestic economic messaging this administration staked its credibility on. That is the bind Washington is operating inside right now. The military operation is running. The economic clock is also running. And every day the strait stays closed, those two clocks move closer together. Trump stated Monday he expected operations to last 4 to 5 weeks. A CIBC analyst said, if oil is where some analysts project by end of March, a U.S. recession becomes a scenario nobody can dismiss. Here is a detail on the March 5th deadline that most coverage is not fully unpacking. War risk insurance cancellations for Gulf-bound vessels take full effect on March 5th. That is 48 hours from now. That date is not arbitrary. It is the point at which ships currently sheltering must either commit to transiting or commit to rerouting entirely around the Cape of Good Hope. Rerouting around Africa adds approximately 15 to 20 days to every voyage from the Gulf to Europe and Asia. That is not a logistical inconvenience. It is a structural repricing of global shipping costs. For every day those rerouted voyages add to transit time, the cost of every barrel delivered rises. Freight rates are already climbing. Shipping companies are revising contracts. That cost lands on consumers. JP Morgan flagged that straight exports have already dropped to around 4 million barrels per day, down from a normal 16 million. A blockage of 3 to 4 weeks, they said, is enough to push Brent past $100. OPEC Plus announced a small output increase for April in response. But most of OPEC's spare capacity sits inside the Gulf. It faces the same exit problem as every other producer in the region. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and the UAE depend on tankers through the strait for the bulk of their exports. OPEC can raise output on paper. It cannot move barrels that have no exit route out of the region. Now here's the layer that almost no outlet is connecting on March 3rd. The US and its Gulf allies have a shared interest in reopening the strait that is arguably stronger than any military objective on the table. Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, the UAE, every Gulf state hosting US military bases also depends on the strait for energy exports and economic survival. They are inside this crisis regardless of their preferences. Saudi Arabia's Ras Tanura refinery came under Iranian drone attack this week. Defenses intercepted the drones, but the facility was shut down as a precaution. Every energy market received that message clearly. Iran demonstrated March 1st and 2nd that Gulf energy infrastructure is within its reach. Not just the strait, refineries, loading terminals, LNG facilities, all sit inside the same threat envelope. Fortune cited analysts warning that a sustained conflict limiting Hormuz transit, while weakening an already fragile global economy, presents what they described as a considerable political risk for Washington. That political risk is now the most powerful pressure toward de-escalation on the American side. Not international law, not diplomacy, oil prices, and what they do to inflation before November midterms. Next, we break down what options remain on the table for Washington, the Gulf states, China, and Iran, because each player is now running against the same economic clock. Stay with me. 2 days ago, Iran had 11 warships in the Gulf of Oman. Today, it has 0. That single CENTCOM statement, published on March 2nd, is the most consequential military fact of this entire crisis. The U.S. Navy did not degrade Iran's surface fleet. It eliminated it. Every surface combatant east of the strait gone in under 48 hours. And yet the strait is still closed. That gap is the whole story. Understanding why destroying Iran Navy did not reopen the strait requires understanding exactly what Iran built its Hormuz strategy around, and which parts of that strategy are still standing as of March 3rd. The most significant single target of the entire naval campaign was not a frigate. It was the Shahid Bagheri, Iran's first dedicated drone carrier, representing years of investment in naval power projection. Converted from a 240-meter container ship commissioned in February 2025, the Shahid Bagheri carried a 180-meter drone runway, helicopters, cruise missiles, and electronic warfare systems on a single hull. It was designed to operate for up to a year without resupply in any ocean far from Iran coastline. Iran described it as a mobile base capable of projecting force across distant waters independently. CENTCOM confirmed the strike. U.S. forces hit the Shahid Bagheri in the opening hours of Operation Epic Fury while berthed at Bandar Abbas. It did not survive the first night of the campaign. Alongside it, CENTCOM confirmed the sinking of a Jamaran-class corvette at Konarak Naval Base in Chabahar. Armed with anti-ship missiles, torpedoes, and surface-to-air systems, one of only 6 ever built. Satellite imagery obtained by the war zone showed the Irans Makrans struck and burning at its pier at Bandar Abbas. Thick black smoke was visible across the entire central portion of the base for over 24 hours. USNI News reported that strikes also targeted Iran's submarine infrastructure at Bandar Abbas. Multiple Ghadir-class mini-submarines were present at the base. Their confirmed operational status today is unknown. Trump laid out 3 objectives on March 2nd: destroy Iran missiles, annihilate their navy, ensure Iran can never build a nuclear weapon. The surface naval objective is largely achieved. The other 2 are not. Here's the critical insight that explains why the strait is still effectively closed even after Iran lost its entire surface fleet. Iran-Hormuz strategy was never built around its surface ships alone. Iran built its Hormuz architecture in 3 independent layers. The surface fleet was the visible layer: the corvettes, the drone carrier, the fast boats that make shipping risk visible and constant. The second layer is mines. Iran is estimated to hold between 5,000 and 6,000 naval mines. Deploying them at scale requires surface vessels. That capability is now substantially degraded by the losses. The third layer remains almost entirely intact. Ghadir-class mini-submarines, inshore fast attack craft operating from protected waterways, and land-based anti-ship missile batteries on the coast. The Ghadir submarines are purpose-built for exactly the shallow, acoustically difficult environment of the Gulf. Small, slow, designed to wait in narrow lanes. Destruction of Bandar Abbas did not eliminate them. CENTCOM confirmed that submarine infrastructure was struck. But commercial satellite imagery shows vessels still present at piers and post-strike images. Whether they are operational is not publicly confirmed. That ambiguity is not a minor footnote for shipping. It is the difference between a strait that can reopen in days and one requiring weeks of active minesweeping and submarine hunting before insurers act. Kevin Book at Clearview Energy framed it precisely on Monday. Iran has 2 ways to restrict the strait: attack ships and lay mines. Without a surface navy, both are harder, but neither is impossible yet. Amrita Sen at Energy Aspects said it plainly on CNBC. The U.S. cannot control one-off attacks by inshore craft, and one-off attacks on tankers are enough to keep the market extremely cautious about sending vessels in. Here is the 25-day number that JP Morgan published Monday, and why it is the most important single data point in global energy markets right now, more important than any military or diplomatic announcement. JP Morgan calculated that 7 major Gulf producers hold approximately 343 million barrels of combined onshore crude storage. That is roughly 22 days of stranded production before onshore storage fills completely. An additional 60 empty tankers in the Gulf region can absorb roughly 50 million barrels more, extending the buffer by 3 to 4 days. Total combined storage buffer, approximately 25 days from when traffic stopped. Beyond 25 days, JP Morgan warned, storage constraints force mandatory production shut-ins across the Gulf. At that point, the disruption is no longer a shipping problem. It becomes a production problem. Production problems do not reverse in days or weeks. They reverse in months. Capping wells and restarting them requires time and logistics that cannot be accelerated by any political announcement anywhere. As of March 3rd, this crisis is on day 5. Gulf producers have approximately 20 days of viable storage remaining before the 25-day threshold is breached. That is the clock everything else is racing against. Wood Mackenzie identified the structural feature that makes this unlike every prior oil disruption in the modern era. This is a dual supply shock, and that distinction matters enormously for price forecasting. Current exports through the strait are halted, and OPEC spare capacity, the global safety valve that historically offsets supply disruptions, is also physically trapped inside the same closed corridor. In 1973, OPEC caused the disruption, and spare capacity existed elsewhere. Today, the disruption and the spare capacity are behind the same closed door. There is no external lever to pull. There is no bypass. Saudi Arabia can announce production increases. The UAE can pledge additional barrels. Those barrels cannot reach global markets until tankers safely transit the strait. The announcement means nothing until then, and tankers will not safely transit until insurers restore war risk coverage. Insurers will not restore coverage until the mine and submarine threat is physically cleared. That process has not started. Physical clearance does not happen through diplomacy. It requires minesweepers in the water and a formal Lloyd S. Joint War Committee assessment. That process takes weeks of active work in the shipping lanes. Macquarie Group energy strategist Vikas Dwivedi put a specific timeline on the pressure curve this week. The world manages 1 to 2 weeks of Hormuz closure with reserves and diversions around the Cape. After week 3, impact escalates rapidly. After week 4, the supply math fundamentally changes in ways that cannot be offset by strategic petroleum reserve releases alone. The numbers do not balance. Today is day 5. Week 2 ends in 9 days. Week 3 ends in 16. The window before the 25-day storage threshold is breached is approximately 3 weeks of real time, starting now. CENTCOM has been precise about what was achieved. All 11 surface ships in the Gulf of Oman removed. Bandar Abbas struck. The Shahid Bagheri confirmed hit in the first hours of the campaign. What CENTCOM has not said, mine threat eliminated. What CENTCOM has not said, submarine force neutralized. Those 2 statements are not military footnotes. They are the conditions for market reopening. The Lloyd S. Joint War Committee call removing the Gulf from its high-risk classification has not come. Until it does, 150 tankers anchored in Gulf waters stay exactly where they are, going nowhere. Every 24 hours without that call adds another day to the countdown. And each day the gap between the available storage buffer and zero narrows by exactly 24 hours, regardless of what anyone announces. Here is the diplomatic dimension that runs parallel to the military picture. It is the layer that could cut weeks off the timeline, or add weeks to it, depending on what happens in the next 48 hours. Trump confirmed on Sunday that Iran interim leadership has reached out and wants to talk, and that he agreed to engage. That signal from a U.S. president while bombs are still falling is not minor. A ceasefire does not require a full nuclear deal. It needs enough political clarity for risk modelers to lower their probability on the next tanker being targeted. That bar is lower than most assume. Bernstein raised its 2026 Brent assumption to $80 in a disruption scenario. Their extreme prolonged conflict case reaches $120 to $150. The gap between those numbers lives in weeks 2 through 4. As of March 3rd, both paths remain genuinely open. Iran's surface fleet is gone. The submarine and mine question is unanswered. The diplomatic channel is active, and the 25-day storage clock is running. Not a victory, not a defeat. A race between the storage clock, the mines still on the seabed, the diplomats in back channels, and the insurers waiting for a clearance signal before they pick up the phone. The outcome of that race determines whether the price of energy, food, shipping, and manufactured goods moves 10% or 50% over the next 6 weeks. Stay with me. A single VLCC supertanker now costs $423,736 per day to charter from the Middle East to China, an all-time record up 94% from Friday. The market is pricing the probability that the next ship gets hit. That number is the clearest single signal of where we stand on March 3rd. Not an analyst forecast, not a government projection. The market itself saying, we do not know if that tanker makes it through. Bloomberg published an editorial today with one sentence that frames the entire strategic picture. The American military does not have weeks to reopen the Strait of Hormuz for oil shipping. It only has days. That framing matters because it shifts the question. The question is no longer whether the U.S. military can eventually reopen the strait. It almost certainly can. The question is whether it can do so fast enough. Fast enough to avoid the 25-day storage threshold. Fast enough to prevent forced production shut-ins. Fast enough to keep oil below $100 before the economic damage becomes self-reinforcing and irreversible. Here is what physically needs to happen before a VLCC captain agrees to transit and before an insurer agrees to cover the voyage. It is not one thing. It is a sequence of 4 distinct conditions that must be met. First, Iran inshore fast attack capability must be suppressed to a level where the probability of a strike on a moving supertanker falls below the insurer risk threshold. That condition has not been met yet. Second, the mine threat must be assessed by minesweepers actually operating in the shipping lanes, producing a formal product that underwriters can review. An announcement is not the same as a physical clearance. Third, the Lloyd S. Joint War Committee must formally downgrade the Gulf from high-risk status. That is not a political decision made in Washington. It is a technical underwriting decision made on physical evidence. Fourth, at least one VLCC must successfully transit with coverage and without incident. That first successful transit is the signal the other 150 waiting tankers need to begin moving, not before that point. Every one of those 4 conditions takes time. And Bloomberg key insight is that the time available is measured in days, not the weeks, that physical clearance operations normally take to complete. Here's the alternative path, the one that does not require physical clearance of the shipping lanes. It runs through diplomacy. It is the faster route if it works. But it has specific conditions attached. Trump confirmed Sunday that Iran interim leadership reached out and that he agreed to talk. Oman is actively mediating. Turkey Foreign Minister Fidan confirmed March 3rd that Ankara is engaged with all parties. A ceasefire signal from Washington, even a 72-hour humanitarian pause, does 2 things immediately. It lowers attack probability enough for risk modelers to reassess, and it gives insurers cover to restore coverage. That is the documented mechanism from the 1988 end of the tanker war. A combination of U.S. naval escorts and a ceasefire signal restored commercial traffic in the Gulf within days of the announcement being made. Operation Earnest Will is the closest historical parallel to now. The U.S. Navy escorted Kuwaiti tankers under American flags through exactly these waters in 1988. That escort program worked and ended the crisis. The difference in 2026 is scale and complexity. In 1988, the threat was mines and fast boats. Today it includes drone swarms, land-based anti-ship missiles, and submarines in a much higher intensity conflict zone. The Saudi East-West pipeline and the UAE Fujairah pipeline are the 2 bypass routes analysts are watching as partial pressure relief, while the strait remains effectively closed to large tanker traffic. Saudi Arabia East-West pipeline capacity is approximately 5 million barrels per day. UAE Fujairah adds roughly 1.5 million more. Combined bypass capacity, approximately 6.5 million barrels per day at maximum. Normal Hormuz throughput for crude and petroleum products is approximately 20 million barrels per day. The pipelines cover roughly 1/3 of that. The remaining 13 to 14 million barrels have no bypass route. K-Peeler confirmed both pipelines face terminal infrastructure constraints at the receiving end. Saudi Arabia Jeddah terminal limits actual throughput well below rated pipeline capacity under current operating conditions. Every analyst covering this crisis reached the same conclusion cited by CBS News. There are no meaningful alternatives to the Hormuz flow. The pipelines help at the margin. They do not solve the underlying problem. Here is where Russia enters the picture in a way that changes the geopolitical calculus well beyond energy markets and beyond the immediate military situation in the Gulf. It requires no action from Moscow. Kapler, on March 1st, noted, the conflict is materially improving Russia's competitive position in crude oil markets. With the Middle East barrels disrupted, both India and China face incentives to increase Russian imports. India imports roughly 60% of its oil from the Middle East. A sustained disruption forces a pivot toward Russian crude, the supply chain that Western sanctions spent 3 years trying to curtail. China was moderating its Russian crude intake as recently as January 2026. K-Peeler assessed that restraint will likely be abandoned entirely if the Hormuz disruption extends beyond a few weeks of real time. Russia does not need to do anything in this crisis to benefit from it. Every day the strait stays closed, Russian crude becomes more strategically indispensable to the 2 largest energy importers on Earth. Here is the consumer-level picture. Every viewer of this channel will feel the effects regardless of whether they track energy markets, geopolitics, or follow any news from the Gulf at all. OECD commercial crude inventories cover approximately 62 days of forward demand according to the IEA. That sounds substantial until you factor in that 20% of global supply is simply not flowing. IEA member states hold approximately 160 million barrels in strategic petroleum reserves available for coordinated release. Authorization, 24 hours. Physical delivery to market, 2 to 4 weeks minimum. Europe faces a secondary shock beyond crude. Roughly 30% of European jet fuel supply transits or originates via the Strait. Every grounded flight and delayed cargo compounds the impact with a lag. Container shipping is being hit separately from tankers. Both Hapag-Lloyd and CMA-CGM have introduced emergency conflict surcharges on Gulf-linked cargo that flow directly into the price of consumer goods. A logistics CEO told CNBC Tuesday his company tried to hire a dry bulk vessel to carry rice to West Africa and lost the ship. The conflict is repricing global shipping capacity far beyond the conflict zone. That is the mechanism by which a war in a 21-mile waterway raises the price of goods in countries with no direct energy exposure to the Gulf. The global shipping market is a single interconnected system. Here is the final frame. The frame that tells you exactly what to watch in the coming days to understand which direction this resolves and how fast each path is actually moving toward any kind of resolution. There are exactly 3 variables that determine the outcome. The first is military. How quickly the U.S. Navy can suppress Iran remaining asymmetric threat to a level that changes the insurer risk calculation. The second is diplomatic, whether the back channel with Oman and Turkey mediating produces a ceasefire signal fast enough to short-circuit the physical clearance process and restore insurer confidence. The third is economic, whether the global reserve and pipeline buffer holds long enough for either path to succeed before forced production shut-ins begin, and the damage compounds over months, not weeks. Bloomberg said it plainly today. The military does not have weeks. It has days. The J.P. Morgan 25-day clock started on March 1st. As of today, March 3rd, approximately 20 days remain. Not a drill. Watch for 3 signals. The first VLCC that successfully transits with coverage. The first Lloyd-S Joint War Committee statement revising Gulf risk status. The first ceasefire signal from Washington or Muscat. Any one of those 3 signals breaks the current equilibrium and changes the trajectory of oil prices, global shipping costs, and the economic outlook for every country on Earth that imports energy or goods. None of those 3 signals has appeared as of March 3rd. The tankers are anchored. The clock is running. And the most consequential stretch of days in global energy markets in 50 years is fully underway. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The next update covers what changed, what movement in those 3 signals means for prices, and what happens if any path closes before the others can deliver. Stay with us.